What's up YouTube? My name is Brett and today we are going to go over everything about Next.js 13, with this video being one of the most in-depth crash courses you're going to find on YouTube. So every section is going to be timestamped below, so if you do want to skip to a certain section, all you have to do is follow the timestamps. This video will go over everything you need to know to become a pro about this full stack framework. This video will go over beginner-friendly concepts all the way to more advanced topics, and we will also use real-world applications for case studies. But before we get started, if you could hit that like button and also subscribe for more content like this will help push it to the YouTube algorithm to get more people to see this video. So with that out of the way, let's get started. So again, welcome to my Next.js 13 crash course, and this is going to be the ultimate guide. The only prerequisite you should have is you should have a basic understanding of React and React components. So if that is good for you, then you should stick around and watch this video and you should be able to get a lot of value out of it. So the first thing is, what is Next.js 13? So Next.js 13 is considered a full stack React framework and is actually the #1 recommended framework that React recommends inside of their official docs. So their official docs is this URL right here, this react.dev/learn/start a new React project, and you will be able to see that it is the recommended framework. You can also view the Next.js 13 docs at nextjs.org/docs. So the main things for Next.js 13, like we said, it is a full stack React framework, and it automatically reconfigures tooling for you like bundling, compiling, and more, which allows you to actually focus building on your application. And it also allows you to render pages on the client and server side. So for the previous version of Create React App that you might be familiar with, it was only rendering on the client. And obviously running on the server has a bunch of benefits that you could take advantage of. So the main benefit of Next.js 13 is the ability to use both server and client components. So components are rendered on the server at build time when using server or static routes. So by default, all of the pages and components inside of Next.js 13 are server-side rendered by default, unless the file is marked with the use client directive, which you will have at the top of your page, and you will have to manually type the use client in a string. But there is going to be cases where you should be using the use client when you're using React hooks and also other event handlers on the component. Because if you're using a React hook like useState or useEffect, you must use a client component since you are having some client-side interactivity. So that means you would have to mark the page as use client or you'll get an error thrown at you. So when should you use server versus client components? So we just touched on that very briefly, but this table is directly from the Next.js 13 docs. So you should use server components when you fetch data. There will be times when you will have to fetch data on the client, but it is recommended to try to fetch data on the server. Also, you should use server components when accessing backend resources directly. And then you also want to keep sensitive information on the server, so like access tokens, API keys, and etc. And also when you do server components, this keeps large dependencies on the server, which is going to reduce the client-side JavaScript, which it means it will actually load pages faster and quicker, improving your Google SEO and load times. So when you want to use the client component, you should use it when you want to add interactivity and event listeners like the onClick or onChange. So like on forms, you might have to use a client component. Another thing is on use state and lifecycle effects. So the use state, use reducer, use effect, any kind of React hooks, they must be client components. Also, another thing that is not on this table is when you're using providers. So there is a bunch of providers out there that you might have to wrap your code in. You should initialize your providers on a client component. Another one is when you use browser-only APIs. You should use a client component. And also when you're using custom hooks that depend on state, effects, or browser or only APIs. And then the last one is when you use React class components, but we're not even going to go over class components because we're just going to use functional components. Okay, so how do you set up your Next.js 13 application? So first off, you need 2 system requirements to make sure you're ready to go, and that is you need Node.js 16.8 or later version, and another is you need a Mac OS, a Windows, and Linux are supported. So you make sure you have that system as well. So you would actually create your Next.js 13 application with 1 line of code initializing your application by typing in npx create-next-app@latest. When you do that, you will get prompted to a few questions like the ones you see below. And other than that, we can go and actually create our first Next.js 13 application using this exact method right here. Okay, so now we are actually going to create the Next.js project. And to do that, we need to open up our terminal. Don't worry about my desktop. I know it's messy. So you should be definitely making sure your desktop and everything is cleaned up and ready to go. But other than that, we're going to open up the terminal on our system. And I am going to change directories into where I keep all of my projects. So I am just going to go into a specific layout. And then inside of there, we're going to run the command npx create-next-app@latest. And like I said, it's going to prompt you to a few questions. So it's going to say, what is your project name? We're just going to put Next.js 13 crash course. Would you like to use TypeScript with this project? I'm just going to say no, because this tutorial has nothing to do with TypeScript, so we don't need to do that. No to ESLint. We're going to say yes to Tailwind CSS. No to the source directory, because with Next.js 13, they moved to a stable version of the app router. Now everything is stable and we can use the app router. So it says use app router, which is recommended. That's a yes. Would you like to customize the default import alias? We're going to say no. And now it's going to initialize our project and also install all of the dependencies. And this should take about 15 seconds to do. And then after we do this, we could change directories again into our project's name. So we're going to press cd next-js 13-crash course. And then we are going to type code dot. And this is going to open up my text editor, which is VS Code. We could close the terminal, and now we are ready to use the Next.js 13 project to actually start coding. So before we actually start coding, let's go over the project structure of a Next.js 13 application. So we are going to go from top to bottom, and you could ignore the .next folder. You do not touch anything in there. That is everything that Next.js does for you, so you don't have to do. We have an app folder, and in this folder is where you're going to do most of your coding. This was introduced in Next.js 13 and replaced the pages folder, but technically you could still use the pages and source folder if you want. So right here we have a favicon icon, which allows you to put icons on top of your tabs for Google Chrome. We have a globals.css file, which gives us the Tailwind configuration. And we also have global CSS styling that's already coming with the project that they have by default. We also have a layout.js file. This is on the root layout of the actual app folder. That's why it is called the root layout right here for the function. It takes in all the children as a prop, and it applies to all of the children, which is technically the whole application. So you would be putting navigation bars, footers, and also headers inside of this root layout. And as you can see, this is where the HTML and body is stored. And this is also a page where you can import Google Fonts, and you could also do metadata. Next page we have, or file, is our page.js, which is our home page. This function is called home, but the page file is called page.js. So in Next.js 13, all of the files have certain convention names that you need to use, but the function can be named whatever you want. So this is the home page. So we are done with the app directory. Next, we just have the node modules. Then we have a public folder that we're going to store all of our images and assets. Then we have a .gitignore, which means we're going to obviously ignore files and folders that we don't want pushed to GitHub. We have a JSON config file, which is just configuration file for JavaScript. We have a next config file, which is just configuration for Next.js. We then have a package.json with a bunch of scripts and dependencies for the project. We also have a post CSS config file, and this is just configuration for a CSS. We also have a README file, which is just basic instructions that Next.js gives to start your project up and start editing it. And then we have our Tailwind config file, which configures Tailwind so it's ready to use and style our project with Tailwind CSS. So that is the basic project structure that you should know before actually getting coding. So let's just move on to the next section of routing. When routing between pages, you might be familiar with the way the Create React app used to route, which is where you had to download a package, usually the React Router DOM, and then you had to route between pages using that package. However, Next.js made it a lot easier to route between pages using a file system based router. This means that the folders are used to define routes, and then the files inside of those folders are used to create the UI and make these routes public. So for example, let's create a few routes now, and I'll show you how easy it is compared to the React Router DOM. So inside of the app directory, we will create a new folder, and whatever we name this folder, that is going to be the URL path for the person to type in on your application. So if we want an about page, like localhost 3000/about, we will just type about. Right now, this page isn't publicly accessible, and that is because we don't have a file with this special file convention of page.js or JSX. So inside of the about folder, we're going to create a page.jsx, and then we're going to do a React functional component using the ES7 snippet inside of your extensions, which is right here. So this is just a snippet to type code quicker and more efficient, and it creates a function. So now we are inside of the page inside of the about route, which is the directory, and we could change the function to whatever name we want. I would name it about page. This does not affect the URL path or the segment at all. We could just say about page, and then I'm going to style this so we can see it better. We're going to have the text center and then text 6XL. Okay, so now we have a route to the /about page. So let's start our server by running npm run dev. We will open up localhost 3000, and we will test to make sure this route is actually working. So this is the home page on localhost 3000. We go to /about, and as you can see, this page is working because it says about page. So that is how you simply create a route inside of Next.js 13. The next route we're going to go over is nested routes. So we want a route nested inside of another route. So for example, /about and then /team. So all we're going to do is create another folder inside of the about folder, and we will call it team. That is going to be the name of the segment. And then we need another page.jsx inside of that folder. We could do RFC and then change this to team page. And then we could style it real quick to see it better. Text center and then text 5XL. We go back to our localhost 3000 and we do /team. And as you can see, this path is working, and this is a nested route. The next route I want to talk about, which I'm briefly going to go over because we'll go more in depth when we're actually fetching data, is a dynamic route. So a dynamic route segment can be called by wrapping the folder's name in square brackets. So for example, say if it's inside of the team folder, we have another folder that is going to be called ID. So the ID maybe of the team member, and this is going to be in brackets. And technically, whatever is inside of the brackets is going to be your parameter. So we need a page.jsx file for this. We could do RFC, and this page will always take in params. and the params is going to be whatever you called inside of the bracket. I'll show you guys how to extract this and use a dynamic route later on in this tutorial, but I just want to give you guys the idea that there is such thing as a dynamic route. And the last thing to do with routing is I want to show you guys how you can organize your routes better, because this will get pretty messy if you have a bunch of nested routes and dynamic routes. So let's delete all of this real quick. So we're going to delete this. So we deleted all of our routes, so we have no more routes anymore. I'm going to create another folder, and this one is going to be with parentheses. So the parentheses is going to negate that as a URL segment. So the parentheses is just to actually categorize what you want. So for us, we could just do marketing. So like if it's just the marketing side of the website, and then we can name the path. So we can name the path, we'll just keep it simple as about again. And then we'll have a file inside that called page.jsx, a React functional component. And so this marketing, whatever we want to include for the marketing side of our application, we could store it inside of here. So we could do another folder called contact. And then we'll have a page for this. RFC. And so now if we want to go to the about page, it's still going to just be /about, and we're not going to take account the marketing folder because it's in parentheses. It's just to categorize and to make everything more organized. So for example, we go to localhost 3000. There's our home page. Now we go to /about. We still get to the about page because it says page right here. It's not /marketing/about. It's just /about. So those are the 4 different types of routes you can use inside of Next.js 13. Obviously, if you look at the docs, there is a little more in depth to it, but that is what you need to know to actually start getting used to routes. So the next thing we're going to go over is actually linking and navigating between routes. So there's 2 main ways to navigate between pages, and that is by using the link component or the useRouter hook. Next.js 13 docs recommend that you should use the link component whenever you can, because it is the more ideal way to navigate between pages. The main reason is because the useRouter hook needs to be on a client side page. So this means you have to use the use client directive on the top of the file to actually use the useRouter hook. And also the link component prefetches the page, making the page load quicker, and also improves your Google SEO performance. So let's go over the link component first. So I cleared out all of the routes, and we'll start from scratch. We are going to create a route called about, and let's create our page with the React functional component. We will call this the about page. Let's style it real quick so we can see it to make sure we're on the page. Text center, and then text 5XL. And now we're going to go to our home page, and we will remove this import at the top of image, remove everything inside of the return. We will go back up, have a regular div as the wrap, h1 for the home. We will style it real quick. We'll have the text center, and then the text 5XL. Okay, so first thing you have to do to use the link component is import it at the top. So we're going to import link from next/link. After that, we could use the link tag, and we have to pass in one required property, which is the href. The href is going to tell us the page we want to navigate to. So it's going to be with the string /about. So we could just say go to about page, and then we close it with the link tag as well. So now let's check our localhost 3000, go to our home page, and as you can see here, we have a home, and then go to about page. If we click this, we are now on the about page, and we just navigated between pages without having to type it up manually here. So that is one of two ways to do it. But I want to go over a few of the properties that you can actually pass through the link component to utilize it even further. Now we are on the Next.js 13 docs inside of the link component section. As you can see, you can pass 3 different properties through the link component. The only required one is the href, but the href also accepts an object. So for the example inside of the docs, they are linking to the about page and also passing the name of test as an object to the about page. So it's going to navigate to the about (name equals test. What we could do is we could create an object as a person. So let's do that real quick. So inside of here, we can remove all of this. And let's create a person right above our function. So we're going to say const person equals, and this person is going to be named John Doe, and it'll be age of 24. Perfect. So now let's have a link, and the link is going to have an href that is going to take in an object. In this object, we're going to have a path name, and this is path name is going to be to the about page. So /about, then you need a comma, and then we are going to have a query, and then we could have it defined as person, and then this person, we're going to JSON stringify the person. Let's close this to make sure we don't have any errors in the right spot. We have this, and then let's just say about page. So let's see what it passes through. It should be passing through this person to our about page. So we are going to go to our localhost 3000, go to the about page, the home page. And when we click the about page, we should be passing through an object in the person inside of the URL. So you see we clicked about, and then if you look at the URL, we have a person with the name of John Doe and the age of 24. So we are actually passing an object now through the link component. Next step we have to do is we have to get that information on the about page using the use search params. Looking at the docs inside of the use search params section, it says the use search param is a client component hook that lets you read the current URL's query string, which is what we're trying to do because we did pass a query through the link component. And as you can see, the use search param is a hook, so that means we are going to have to pass in the directive use client at the top, and then we also have to import the use search params at the top from next/navigation. And this is all going to be on the about page. So we can start working on that now. We are going to go to our about page. We'll mark the directive use client at the top. So now this is a client side rendered page because we are importing the use search params. And this is from, let me just confirm, next/navigation. I could just copy that over. We are going to initialize the use search params by saying const search params equals the use search params. Then we want to get that person, right? So we're going to say const person equals search params dot get, and then we're getting the person object. So if we want to console log, we can console log this. And since it is a client side rendered page, it's going to be in our client side console. So let's go back to our localhost 3000. Let's go to our localhost 3000, open the inspect React DevTools. We are going to go to the console. Let's go to the about page. And as you can see in the console, it says name John Doe, age 24. And that means we're actually console logging the right information. Now we just have to extract this data so we could actually display it on the page. So let's go back to our VS Code editor. We can remove the console log because we know it's working. And now we could store the result. We could just name this variable whatever we want. And we could parse that JSON. And we're going to parse the person because that is the variable we're storing it in. And then if you wanted to console log the results, you can see how they look as well. But I know we parsed that data. So inside of the about page, we could remove this. And then we could have dynamic brackets right here. And we could have results.name, because that's one of the things we passed. And then we also passed results.age. So let's see if those information are popping up on the about page. So as you can see, it just says John Doe 24. So let's go back to our localhost 3000. We go to the about page and John Doe 24 because we're passing in that person. We could change the information that we want. We could name this my name, Brett. Go back to our localhost 3000. Click about page, and as you can see, it says Brett 24. So with the link component, you can pass objects. You could pass different strings through the component and then retrieve the data using the useSearch params to actually get that query from the URL's query string. So that is a very useful way that you can use the link component. One of the main features of the link component is prefetching data and prefetching the page. But the only way that works is inside a production ready application. So this project that you see right here is already pushed to production. So we're going to be able to see the power of prefetching in real time. So I am going to open up my DevTools and I'm going to go to the network tab. And I'm going to go to the pricing page because there I have 4 links to a calendar page, which will set up the person's information so they could actually rent a dumpster. So we are going to go to the pricing page. And when I scroll over the buttons that have the link component, you're going to see that it's going to prefetch the calendar page and it is passing a query through the URL path. And you're going to be able to see it pop up right here. And I have 4 different prices, so you're going to see 4 different calendar pages get prefetched here. So I'm going to scroll down. And as you can see, the first calendar page is already prefetched right there with the query of price passed through. We're going to scroll down further. There's our second calendar page, our third calendar page, and then our 4th calendar page. So if we click any of these buttons which have the link component, it's almost instantaneous navigating to the page because it's prefetched. It helps reduce the load time when navigating, and it also increases your Google SEO and ranks you higher. So this is one of the biggest benefits for using the link component because it is fetching everything through the server and prefetching the page. The other way to navigate through pages, like we said, is using the useRouter hook. This allows you to programmatically change routes inside of client components. So you have to mark the file as a used client directive, and then you have to import the useRouter hook from Next.js/navigation. So we're going to copy that. Then you have to initialize the router, and then you can have a button with on click with the router.push to the page you want to go. So let's do that real quick. We are going to remove everything in the home page, have a div. So we're going to move everything inside the div, and then we're just going to have the h1 of home. Remove the person as well. Remove the link. We'll have a use client. And then right below that, like I said, we're going to import the useRouter from Next/navigation. And then we have to initialize the router as well. So const router equals useRouter. We could have a button. Go to about page. We can have an on click. The on click will have an anonymous function that goes to the router.push, and it'll go to the page /about. So let's test this out to make sure it's working. So we are on the localhost 3000. As you can see here, it says go to about page. We click it. and it says can't read properties, reading name null. Reason why is because on the about page, we still have our search params, which we could get rid of. We could keep use client. We could just put about page and then test it out again. So go to localhost 3000, go to about page, and now we navigated to a page using the useRouter hook. So let's go back and review real quick how you can navigate pages. You can navigate pages either through link component or the useRouter hook. Most of the time you should be using the link component, and it has a lot more benefits to it. So let's move on to the next section of this crash course. Fetching data inside of Next.js 13's app router has a new simplified way to fetch the data using the Fetch Web API. As you can see, we are inside of the docs, inside of the data fetching section, and they give us 4 main recommendations we should follow when we're fetching data. And number 1 is we should always try to fetch data on the server using server components. Reason being is we get a bunch of benefits for fetching data on the server. For example, we have direct access to backend data resources. We also get to keep our sensitive information more secure because we're not exposing it on the client side. When we also fetch data and render in the same environment, this reduces both the back and forth communication between the client and the server. This will also reduce the client server waterfalls. We can also perform multiple data fetches with a single round trip instead of multiple individual requests on the client. This is going to help you with load times and improve your Google SEO. Recommendation number 2 is you should try to fetch data in parallel to minimize waterfalls and reduce the loading times. So if you're fetching from 2 separate endpoints, you should try to fetch the data at the same time, and then the data will load in when both requests are fulfilled. This is number 2 recommendation. For number 3 is for layouts and pages, we should fetch data where it's used. So Next.js automatically deduplicates the request in a tree. So when you're fetching data, by default, it's going to store in a temporary cache. So when we are trying to fetch that same endpoint again, we could get the data from the temporary cache, and you get the data quicker and more efficient without having to go back and forth between the client and the server. And then number 4 recommendation is we should use a loading UI, streaming, and suspense to progressively render a page and show results to the user while the rest of the content loads. So what we're going to use in this tutorial is we're going to use React Suspense, and this will allow us to fetch 2 separate endpoints, and the first endpoint will show on the screen for the user while the second endpoint shows a loading state showing that we're trying to fetch the data. This improves the user experience and quality and just makes your application a lot smoother and more professional looking. So let's get into it. We are going to fetch from 2 separate websites that allow us to fetch data from. The first one is going to be from dog.co/dog-api/. This allows us to fetch random dog images. So every time we press this fetch button right here, it will fetch a random dog image, as you can see right here. And this URL is going to be the endpoint we are fetching from. So all we have to do is copy this, and then we could go into our text editor, and inside of the text editor we are going to go to the home page. We don't have the use client directive on here, so this is a server side rendered page, and like recommendation number 1 says, we want to fetch data from the server. So we are going to have an async function up here. In this function, we are trying to get dogs, so we're going to call it get dogs. And then inside of the code block, we are going to have a response. And then we're going to await the fetch from that specific endpoint that we just got from the dog API. So I'm going to paste it in here. And now we're fetching from this specific API endpoint. So now we want to make sure we get the data in JSON format. So we're going to say const data equals response.json. and we're going to store it in a data variable. And then we just have to return the data. Now we can call and initialize the getDogs function right below our home main function here on our home page. So we're going to store this in a dogs variable. So we're going to say const dogs equals await get dogs. And since we're using the await keyword, we have to make this function asynchronous. So it's an async function awaiting get dogs. And what we could do here is we can console.log the dogs to see what we get. So we could run the server again. So npm run dev, go to localhost 3000. And we loaded our home page, so that means we should have fetched the data since it is just on the initialization. And as you can see here, we get a get of 200. And you have to look in the console of the server because it is server-side rendered. And we are looking for a console log of this information. So let's see if we can see it. So we run the development server. We compiled the client and the server successfully. And let's refresh the page to see if we get it this time. Let's see. Let's refresh. And here is the console log right there. So we get an object back with a message, and this is a JPEG. And then we get a status of success. So that means we have to extract the message so we can actually display it. So we are going to do that inside of the JSX using the image component. We will go more into depth about the image component later on, but all you have to do is you have to import it at the top from next image. Just like that, and now we could use the image tag that you must use for Next.js, and the source is going to be the dogs.message because that is where the JPEG is. And then we could just autocomplete with this Copilot with the width of 500 and a height of 500. And then we also need an alt tag, which is required. And we could just say dogs. So you need a width, a height, and the alt of dogs. We will get an error message here, and I'll show you exactly why. So if you go over here, well, this is an error message I was expecting, but I didn't spell async right. So let's do async here. Go back to our local host, and now it's saying we have an invalid source prop, and it's because of this JPEG. And the reason why is because we haven't configured the host name images.dog.co inside of our next config file. So I'm just going to copy this, and we are going to go inside of our next config file. We're going to go inside of the next config object. We're going to have the images. And the images is going to have an object, and then this will have the domains with an array, and it'll be a string, and then we could copy that URL, images.dog.ceo. It's going to stop your server, so you're going to run it again. It will automatically stop the server. We could open up localhost 3000 again. And then as you can see here, we have successfully fetched a dog image from using the fetch on a server component. So one of the reasons why I wanted to fetch data from this specific API is because every time you fetch from this endpoint, you should be getting a different dog image. So if I press refresh, you're going to see it's the same dog image. So you're going to be like, what's wrong with the code? I don't understand what's going on. I should be getting a different dog image. And there is a reason, and the reason is because by default, Next.js stores all of the fetch requests in a temporary cache. And it's just going to deduplicate the fetch request, and it's going to keep fetching from that temporary cache. So it's going to keep fetching the same data, and the same data is going to show you the same dog image. So what we have to do is we have to put a comma after the endpoint with an object, and inside of it, we have to put cache, and then we're putting no cache. And that is because we do not want to store the cache. So we're going to say we don't want to store the cache. and we want to fetch new data every time from this endpoint. So we're going to go back, and it already reloaded a new dog for us. And then we could press reload, and then it reloads another dog, reloads another dog, reloads another dog, and then reloads another dog. So that is how you can get away from storing data in a temporary cache. There's other ways you can do it with using revalidate. So we can do next, and I think it's an object, and then revalidate, and then we could put like every 5 seconds. I'm pretty sure that's the syntax. Let's 100% make sure. So after every 5 seconds, we're going to be able to revalidate to the data and fetch new data. So we're going to press refresh. And then we're trying to refresh it, refresh. And then after 5 seconds, it lets us refresh a new dog. So you can see here, I'm just clicking the refresh button. And then after 5 seconds, we get another dog. So there's 2 methods you can use. You can use the revalidate method, or you could use the no cache to keep fetching brand new data. And if you're fetching data that's static, there's no point of using these option parameters. So the next endpoint I want to fetch from is from the JSON placeholder.typecode.com. So let's go to that website real quick. And we could do a Google search of JSON placeholder. And it is jsonplaceholder.typecode.com. This is like a free fake API just so we can start testing and making sure we practice with fetching data on Next.js 13. If we scroll down, we see a bunch of resources and routes that we could fetch from. And we are going to fetch from the users, because I feel like people, when they create applications, every application usually has a user, so why not fetch users? If we click this endpoint, we get 10 different users with different properties like name, username, email, address, a bunch of different nested objects as well. But we do get 10 users from this. So I'm going to copy this endpoint so we have it for later. And we are going to fetch all of the users on a server component. So it's almost similar to what we did just to the get dogs. So we can remove the function of get dogs, remove the import of image, remove everything related to that function. And now we are back to our home page. We could keep async right here because we're going to have to wait a request here anyway. So we are going to create an async function, and we are going to call this get all, or we could just say get users with the s at the end. And inside of the code block, we are going to have a response that is going to await the fetch from that endpoint. So we could paste that endpoint in here. And this is the endpoint that you're going to have. And then right below that, we are going to have to store it in a data variable and get a JSON. So const data equals await response.json, and then we just got to return the data. So our get users function is working and ready to go. Right here, we could say const users equals await get users, and then we could just console log all the users. So it's very, very similar to what we just did with the dogs. So we could see the console log of 10 different users inside of our server with all of the properties. So now we fetched these users successfully, and we can actually display now inside of the return. And there is one thing that we should check too. After we get the response, we could do a check right here to see if the response went through or not. So we could say if the response is not okay, we can throw a new error with a string that says fail to fetch users, like that. Close the code block and then continue with our code. So that's just a check. It is also in the Next.js 13 docs, and that is how you're just going to check to see if the fetch endpoint is working correctly. We're going to clean up this code a little bit too here. We do not want to usually call functions inside of the home page or whatever page. we want to call functions like this inside of a utils folder. So we could have a new folder called utils inside of the app directory, or you could just do it in the root layout. Doesn't really matter. Then we have a new file in there. We could say get users.jsx. And then we could go back to our home page. We could copy all of this. We could just cut it. And then we will paste it inside of the get users function. And we just have to export default because we want to export it from this page. And so we're exporting the function get users. So we could come back in here. We could get rid of this await and this console log, because what I'm going to do here is I'm going to import a link from next/link. And then right below this page, I want a link to a users page. So we're going to do a link href equals /users, close it. And then we're going to say go to users page. And we don't have a users page, so we can create that. We can actually just rename this about page to users. So now we have a users page. And then inside of this, we could call this users page. Have an h1 here that says users. And then we don't have to do a p tag of users will be listed. Now we must import that function from the utils folder. So we're going to go to the top. We're going to say import get users. And then it's from the utils folder and the get users file. So then after we have that, we have to await the data and actually initialize the function. So we're going to say equals await get users. And since we're using await, we must use a sync. And then after this, now we can start mapping it through the users. So right below this h1, I am going to do curly braces, and we're going to say users.map. That's not a curly brace, so users.map. And then we're going to map through each user. And then we have to have a return. And inside of return, we're going to have a fragment. And then inside of the fragment, we could have a p tag. And this p tag will have a key, which will be the user.id. And then inside of that, we're going to have the user.name. So we're extracting the name property from the user object. Now we just have to make sure everything is closed up properly. So what we have to do here is we have this. Then we have this. We want this and then this. Looks like I'm messing up somewhere on the code block. Let me redo this whole thing real quick. So we have users.map. And we're mapping through the user. It will be an arrow function. It'll be curly braces. I think that's what I messed up on last time. We're going to have a return. Inside the return, we could have a fragment. Then we could have a p tag, which is going to have a key to user.id. And we're going to extract the user.name like we said earlier. And now we have that covering that. We have this. Let's remove this. And it looks like everything is good to go. So now we can make sure everything went through properly, and we can see if we're mapping through all the users on the users page. So let's go to our localhost 3000. Make sure your development server is running. So we can just refresh the page. Looks good. As you can see here, we have the home page, and go to users page. We click it, and we have all of the users listed right here. And as you can see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 users. So we just fetched data on the server again with all the users. Now we are going to fetch all of the users using dynamic data. So when we talked about that dynamic route earlier in the tutorial in this course, now we're actually going to implement it by fetching dynamic data. We are back on the JSON placeholder.typeeco.com. And if we look at the routes, we could go to the /users again. And then if we want to get one of the users, right after in the URL path users, we're going to have like a /2. If we have a /2, we're going to get the ID 2, which is Irvin Howell, and we'll get this specific user. So this ID is going to be dynamic based on what we click on the person's name on the application. So if we get number 8, we're going to get Nicholas, whatever his last name is, Nicholas, and we just keep getting different users 1 through 10. So what we could do here is we could copy this, and we are going to create another function inside of the util folder, and we could call this file get user.jsx, and we could do an async function called get user, and then inside of the code, first let's actually export it. So export default, because we're not going to keep it in this file. We're going to have a const response equal to await, and then fetch, and then users, and then it's not always going to be the number 1. So like I said, it is going to be dynamic. So when it is dynamic, we have to pass a parameter of whatever we're going to pass into here. So we have to create a dynamic route first so we know what the parameter is. So to do that, inside of the users folder, I'm going to create another folder, which is technically a nested route, and we are going to use the brackets like that. So my parameter is going to be the ID, and I'm going to create a page.jsx file, and this is going to be the public facing UI for whatever user we pick. So we could just have RFC, and we could change this name to user page. We could remove the import from React at the top, and we can leave this for now, this file. And when we go back inside of the get user function, we know that the parameter is the ID. So we're going to pass in the ID here. And then this is going to be dynamic, so we need to use template literals. So I'm just going to highlight all this, do a template literal, and then for here we're going to do a money sign, curly braces, and ID. So whatever ID they click based on the parameter, that is going to be the user's page we go to. So next, we could check the response real quick, like Next.js recommends. So we're going to say if the response is not okay, we're going to throw a new error immediately saying we failed to fetch this user. So when we fail to fetch the user, after that, we're just going to get the response.json. So we could just do a return response.json. So there is our function right there for our get user, passing in the parameter of ID. So now we want to go back to our dynamic route page, which is under the ID dynamic route here. And we're on the user page now, and now we want to import that function. So we're going to import the get user, and this is going to be from the utils folder in the get user file. After we do that, we're going to make this an async function because we know we're going to have to use it. And then we have to pass the params in here. And like I said, the params, we could actually destructure it further, and it is just going to be the ID. So what we can do here, right above the return, is we could say const user data equals await, and we're getting the user ID and passing in that ID again. So after we do that, we could have the return, and in the return, we can actually start mapping out the user when they click it. Before we start mapping out the properties we want to show from the user on the get user page, which is the dynamic page, we have to go back to all of the users page, which is just the /users page. And we have to import a link because we're not going to be able to actually click the person's name and link to another page. And when we're linking to another page, we're going to link to a dynamic route. So we are going to, inside of the p tag, have the link tag, and GitHub Copilot actually is correct there, and we are going to link to the /users and then / whatever the user ID is, and it has to be in a template literal like this. And then right under the username, we can close the link, and we should be able to link to that specific page of the user.id. So now when we go in here, we could just say h1, which is going to be the user data dot name. So the name should pop up. We could just do a class name of text center, and then we could just do text of 6XL. So we could actually see the name. Let's go to our localhost 3000. Let's go back to our home page. Let's go to the users page. And then now let's click a name like Patricia. So we click Patricia, it says Patricia. Let's go back. Let's click Leanne, and it says Leanne. And as you can see here in the URL, it's users /1. We click Glenna, we get Glenna, and it's users /9. So that is pretty much how to successfully route to dynamic routes using Next.js 13. And the last thing I want to show you, if you remember from this beginning section of fetching data, is you could fetch data in parallel, which we are going to, but we're going to just go right into using the Suspense from React. So another data point we are going to fetch from that JSON website is the user's post. So inside of the utils folder, we are going to create another file, and we're going to say get user post, and it'll be .jsx. So now we're going to create that function to get the user's post. So to do that, we are going to be inside of here, and we're going to export default async function. We're going to get the user's post and pass in the ID. So then after, we're going to set a variable called response, and we are going to await a fetch request. And the fetch request, we could keep this for now. And I think this is actually the right endpoint. So what we're doing here is we are getting the post, and we are matching up the user ID with the ID that was clicked. And then we could just check to see if the response was okay. So if it isn't, we're going to get a new error thrown at us saying it failed to fetch the user post. And then let's just return a response.json and close the code. So that is it for the get users post function. Now we can actually call this function inside of our dynamic route page right here. First, we have to import that function, which is called get user post from the utils folder. And then now we're going to fetch both of the data simultaneously. And then we're going to display one. And then we're going to use React Suspense to throw a loading state to show that it is loading the other fetch request before it actually displays. We have to initialize both of the requests in parallel though. So I'm going to have a comment right here saying initiate, if I could spell right, initiate both requests in parallel. So what we're going to do here is we are going to have the user data, but we're going to take away the await keyword. So we're actually not going to await the data yet. We're just going to initialize both requests in parallel. And then we could just name the other one users post, and we're going to say get users post with the ID. So now we are going to actually await for the data of one of them. So we're going to store it in a user variable, and we're going to await the user data, just like that. Now, like I said, we have to await for the other get users post request by using React Suspense. So we could import Suspense from React at the top. Suspense from React. And now we could actually use Suspense from React. And what we can do here is we can have right below this H1, which we have the user. So it's going to be user.name, not userdata.name, because we stored it in the user variable now. We're going to have the user.name, and then below that, we are going to have a component which we haven't created yet. So we're going to have a component called user post. And for the user's post, we are going to have a promise that is equal to the user's post, which was right here. And we're going to get an error thrown at us because it's saying we can't find the user's post component, which we haven't created yet. So let's go inside of our app directory, create a new folder called components, and inside of there, a new file called user post.jsx. We're going to do RFC, remove the import from React at the top. Let's go back into our dynamic route, make sure everything matches up, and then import it from the top so we get that error away. So now we have the import at the top for the user's post. And then what we want to do here is we actually want to create the user's post, but then we also want to wrap the user's post in Suspense. This is just going to give you a better experience for the end user. And so what this means is it has a fallback of if this doesn't load, we're going to have a fallback of a div that just says loading ... So now let's create the actual component of the user's post. So inside of the user's post page, we are going to accept a prop, which is promise. Reason why is because if you go back to the ID, we are passing in the user's post, which we get from the get users post function into our promise variable right here. So we have to take in the promise, and then what we can do here is we can store it in a variable called post, because that's what it is, and we're going to await the promise, and we have to make sure this is async because we're using await. So it's an async function. And then inside of the return and inside of the div, we can map through all the posts. So we can have a UL, an order list, and we can say post.map, and we're going to iterate through all the posts. And then what we're going to have here is we can have a return, and then we have an LI with, we have to have a key when we map through items of post to ID. We could have an H2, and then that could be post.title. And if you want to know the properties of the post object, you can just console log everything like the post, and you can see the parameters that are in here. So we have an ID, we have a title, and then we also have a body. So we need to close the LI, close everything here, and then this function is ready to go. We already have it imported here, and then everything should work properly. So let's just make sure everything is working good. And as you can see, we are getting the name here at the very top, and then we are getting the post here. Let's just look and see if everything's working. As you can see, that loading screen popped up very quickly. And obviously, if somebody has a slower computer, the loading will stay there until the fetch request is promised. So let's do Irvin. Irvin, how is working? Chelsea's working. Clementa is working. And I'm going to set a timeout so you guys could actually see the loading process take effect. So we're going to set a timeout, and we're going to make sure we await the fetch for 3 seconds. To set the timeout, we are going to set it here inside of the get users post function, inside of the utils folder. Right above the response, we're going to await a new promise, and the resolve, we're going to set a timeout for 3000 milliseconds, which is 3 seconds. And if we are waiting 3 seconds for this data, that means our React Suspense is going to take effect and is going to fall back on loading ... You can create any loading component you want here and pass it through here and make it a lot better. So let's go back to our Next.js 13 app. We could go to Leannegram, and it says loading, and then it shows us the page. So that shows how we can use a loading UI and Suspense to make the user experience a lot better. Obviously, I didn't style the UI that great, but you get the job done and you get the concept of how it works. So that is it for the section of data fetching. Now wait till the next section, and if you want, like I said, there is timestamps inside of the YouTube video, so skip to whatever section you feel you need to. So Next.js 13 has a metadata API that can be used to define your application's metadata inside of the HTML head element, and this will help for improved SEO and web shareability. So the two methods I am going to show you inside of our text editor is static metadata and dynamic metadata. So static metadata is specific to a specific page, and this can be done inside of a layout.js file or a page.js file. So if we go to our home page, which we're on right now, all we have to do, if you're using JavaScript, you do not have to import anything, but if you're using TypeScript, you must import the metadata object. But if you're just using JavaScript, you could say export const metadata, and then it's going to equal an object. And then inside of the object, you could have different properties. So the two main ones that they show in the example is title. So the title is going to show up on the Google Chrome at the top. So you should name the page whatever you want to name it. If you're on the home page, you can name it home page. And then you can also have a description of whatever the page is. So like this is the home page. So we are going to open up our server real quick, and I'm going to show you exactly where the title is. And this is static metadata, and this only applies to whatever page or layout that you apply it to. So if we open up our localhost 3000, you see here at the top left, it says homepage. And if you didn't have metadata up there, it would just say something like Next.js 13. And you could change this. We could say Brett Westwood, which that is my name. We could go back to localhost 3000, and now it says Brett Westwood up here. So that changes the title of the pages. But what happens if you have a bunch of blog posts and you're routing to dynamic routes? You need the metadata to be dynamic as well. So that is how you do static metadata. Now, to do dynamic metadata, you go into your dynamic page or layout, and all you have to do here is you have to use the generate metadata function. So you can do this right above all the other functions you already have in your code. So we're going to export an async function called generate metadata. This is going to take in the params as a prop. And then what we do here is we're going to destructure the params just to the ID. So you can either destructure it inside of the parameter parentheses or right below it. So let's open up our code block. And first we have to fetch our function. So either you could fetch it inside of the code right here, which will look messy, but we already fetched the user ID inside of our get user function here in the utils folder. So we don't have to fetch it again. All we have to do is initialize the get user and make sure it's imported at the top. So we have it imported at the top, and we could set this to the user variable, and we're going to await the get user passed in the ID parameter inside of the function. After that, all we have to do is return an object, and right here, the title is going to be the user.name, so whatever that person's name is, and then the description can just be like user.email. You could name the title whatever property that you want that's actually available with the user's object, but it has to be a property that's actually available with the user object, and name is available and so is email. So if we go back to our localhost 3000, we go to our users page, we click Leanne Graham, and you see here at the top, the actual metadata for the title is Leanne Graham because we marked it as the user.name. So that is how you do dynamic metadata using the generate metadata function. And then you also do static metadata just by exporting the metadata inside of a page or layout folder. Let me just pull over the docs real quick so you can see I'm not bluffing. So if you go to the metadata section inside of Next.js 13, you have static metadata, which here's the example. And then you also have dynamic metadata, which here's an example as well. This is obviously a little more advanced, and my example I feel like is a lot easier to understand than reading all of this. But you definitely have to use the generate metadata function to fetch metadata that requires dynamic values. So Next.js lets us use Google Fonts, and they let us use Google Fonts in a very efficient way. So you can automatically self-host any Google font, and this means we're not going to send any requests to Google by the browser. And they also recommend you use the variable fonts for the best performance and flexibility. And you get started by importing the font you'd like to use from next/font/Google. So all of this will automatically optimize your fonts. And like I said, it removes any external network request for improved privacy and performance. So the one that you get by default is the enter font from next/font/Google. It is a variable font, and you can still use variable fonts, but if you don't use a variable font like Roboto, you have to make sure you specify the weight. So for example, let's use Roboto, which is a very popular font. So we can remove the enter one on our application. We will paste it here. You must import at the top, and then you have to store it in a variable like this. And you have to specify the weight since this isn't a variable font. And then if you want to use it, you could have it as a class name with curly braces, then the variable name like Roboto, and then dot class name. So let's open up npm run dev, open up localhost 3000. And now since all of the children are wrapped with that specific font, all of our fonts should be the Roboto theme. So if we go to users, as you can see, our font has changed up a bit. Let me go back to the previous font so you can see the difference. Now we're on the inner font, and you can see if I refresh the page, the font is a little different. And then I could copy and paste that again, just to show you real quick. We could change the font weight to like 800 so you could really see it. Change this to Roboto. And then there's an unknown weight of 800 for font whatever, and it tells you the available weights are 100, 300, 400, 700, 900. So we could use 900 just so you can see the very difference in the fonts. We go back, and as you can see, it's very bolded. So that is the simple way to change fonts inside of Next.js 13. And like I said, you could go over the docs. They recommend you use variable fonts. It gives the better performance and flexibility. You will import the fonts inside of a layout file, and you'll also define them inside the layout file. And then you could use them within any of the children pages just by initializing the class name with the font name dot class name. And other than that, you can use multiple fonts like this. You can import multiple runs from next/fonts/Google. And then as you can see here, you can also import the font into a page and then use it within a certain H1, a P tag, whatever you want to use it in, you can. And if you go through the docs, there's a bunch of examples that you could use, and I recommend definitely going through them. But that's just the basic crash course of using Google Fonts. And like I said, check out the docs if you have any more questions, or leave a comment down below. Okay, so I want to go over the image component inside of Next.js 13. There's two main ways I want to show you how you can import an image, and one is from your local images on your computer, either a JPEG, PNG, or web image files. And then the other one will be from remote websites. So any websites you find on the internet that has a image string, you will be able to initialize that website inside of your next config file and use that image inside of your application. So the first one I want to go over is the local image. So for that, you have to have an image on your system, and you can drag and drop it inside of the public folder. So for example, I have a hero.png. I could close this, and then we must import the image tag up top from next/image to use it. Then it is a self-closing tag, and then there's 4 props that are required when using the image tag. 1 is the source, 2 is the alt property tag, 3 is the width, and 4 is the height. So we're going to have a source, and then it is going to be a string to that specific local file. So for us, it is just going to be /hero.png. The width could be 200, the height could be 200, and we can have an alt tag of hero image, and then it's a self-closing tag. So all we have to do is now open up our localhost 3000, and as you can see here, our image is popping up. I can make it bigger. You can make it bigger by just changing the width and height properties. So 1200 and 1200. And as you can see here, the image is displaying inside of our localhost 3000. So that is all you have to do. You have to navigate inside of the public folder, get the name of the PNG or JPEG file, and then you could use it inside of your image tag. So the other way you could do it is you can search on Google for any image you want. I have searched for this one right here. You could copy the image address, and then when you copy the image address, I'm going to remove this image here. You should get a long string that looks like this, and now we have to configure it inside of our next.config file so we could actually use it. So what we could do here is we could just remove this for now, put the image tag again, and then the source is going to be in a string with that specific link right here. Then we could have an alt, a width, a height, and then the alt. And we could just name it image, and then a self-closing tag. And then if we open our localhost 3000, it's going to give us an error saying that we have an invalid source prop. We need to include the host name of blog.hubspot.com, and we have to configure it under images inside of our next config file. So we could go to our next config file. Inside of this object, we could have images, and then that would be an object. And then inside of there, you could either do it with domains this way, but they recommend doing it a different way, which let me pull that up real quick. They recommend you using remote patterns. And this is because this is going to help to protect your application from malicious users, it says, and the configuration is required in order to use these external images. So what we're going to have here is we're going to have remote patterns. And inside the remote patterns, it'll be an array and an object inside there. And the first one is going to be the protocol, which is just going to be HTTPS semicolon. Then the next will be the host name. And the host name is going to be the blog.hubspot.com. We need a port, and the port is just going to be an empty string. And then we need the path name. And the path name is going to be whatever it is after the .com. And after the .com, it is actually this string right here. So that should be it. After you start editing your next config file, your development server will stop running. You can say npm run dev again. And saying we have invalid, the value must be one of the following HTTPS or that. So we just got to take away the semicolon. Accidentally added that. And let's do npm run dev again. Open up our localhost 3000. We'll move it over. And we should get image popping up right there. That is exactly from that Google image that we searched on Google. So those are the 2 separate ways you could do image tags inside of Next.js 13. Like I said, you could either import a local file inside of your public folder and use it inside of the image tag, or you can config a remote file a remote image inside of your next config like this, and then use that string of the image URL inside of your image tag, and you could use remote sources. So hopefully this helps you a lot, and let's move on to the next section of using route handlers like the GET request and POST request inside of Next.js 13's new route system. So the last thing I want to go over inside of this course is the route handlers inside of Next.js. So route handlers allow you to create custom request handlers for a given route using the web request and response APIs. So the route handlers are defined using a route.js or TS file inside of the app directory. So instead of using a page.js or TSX file, you're using a route page convention. And then inside of that page for the route.ts or JS, you must create a function that has the name of the HTTP request you're going to use. And the supported HTTP methods that are allowed on Next.js is the get, post, put, patch, delete, head, and options. So if this method is not allowed and you're using a method that I didn't just list, then you're going to get a 405 method not allowed response. So the two methods I want to run are going to be the get and post request, and show you how to create those inside of Next.js 13 using the backend route handlers. So the get request we're going to do is going to be us getting prices from Stripe product dashboard. So we're going to get the prices, and then we're going to display the prices on our front end. And then we are going to run a post request, because we're going to act like we have a form on the front end where somebody fills in their name and email. And then we'll send it to the back end and then spit out the information back to the front end. So if we scroll down here, we could see for the GET request, before we actually write the code, you could either fetch the data or you could use methods inside of certain packages that we download. And like we are going to have a Stripe package and use methods from Stripe instead of using this fetch request as you see in the example. Another thing is when using GET request, if you do not pass a request inside of the params, then the routes are statically evaluated by default. But then if you do pass a request inside of the GET function, then it is going to be a dynamic route handler, and they're going to be evaluated dynamically. And every other request, like a post request, is evaluated dynamically, but we are going to start with the GET request. So we are going to go to the code editor, and I cleared everything out from all of the pages, so it's like we almost have a brand new application. And what we're going to do is we are going to create a folder called API. So this backend routing works the same as the public facing routes, which is the folder names are the endpoints paths. So this is going to be localhost 3000 / API. And then we could create another folder called prices. So it's going to be / API / prices, and then a file called route.js. So what we're going to do here is we are going to first, if you haven't already, I'm going to install the Stripe package. And then when we have the Stripe package installed, if you haven't, you will create products inside of stripe.com with prices and different data points. And then after you do that, you're going to get the API key, and you could just do this all in test mode, so you're not actually using a real credit card on file. After that, we must import Stripe at the top, so we could use methods from Stripe. And then one more import is we must import Next response from Next / server, because Next response is an extension of the response web API, and it gives you more functionality, so we can do more stuff with it. Now we're going to create the function, so it's export async function, and the name of the function is get, because that's the HTTP method we're using. And we don't have to pass anything inside because we aren't getting data dynamically. It's going to be the same prices every time. So the first thing we are going to do is we're going to initialize Stripe. So we're going to say Stripe equals new Stripe, and then we are going to pass in the process.env.stripe secret key. And I already added my secret key to this env.local file. You should add yours as well and make sure nobody sees that key. After we initialize Stripe, we are going to call a method called stripes.prices.list. This means we're going to list all of the prices inside of our dashboard. And then you could do a few different properties, like if it's active and true, it'll list it. And we could set a limit to 4, so we're only showing 4 different prices and products. And then we could close this. So that works. And if you want, you can actually console log the prices now. And if you console log it, it is a server-side page. So that means the console will show up right here and our console down low in the text editor. So we just need to return a response.json, and we are going to return prices.data. And the reason why we're doing prices.data is because if you do console log the prices, we have to go inside of the data, and then inside of the data is where all of the information is. So that's why I just put prices.data. So to check this, to see if it's actually working, we could go to the route of localhost 3000 /API /prices, and then see if we get some JSON data passed to that actual endpoint. So we could go to localhost 3000, make sure it's running, and then /API, and then /prices. And as you can see here, we get 4 different IDs with prices and a bunch of different data that we can use to show to the user. So that means this backend endpoint is working, and now we could fetch it in the front end to actually display the prices to our users on our application. To retrieve the data on the front end, I am just going to use the page.js file, which is on the root of our app directory, and this is technically our localhost 3000, which is the home page. So what we have to do is we have to store the information inside of state to display it. So we have to use the useState hook. So we're going to mark the page with the useClient, and then we are going to import useState, and we're also going to import the useEffect hook from React. After we do this, we can just get rid of the metadata. We don't need it. It's just in the way. And then the other thing we are going to do is we could actually declare the state now. So we're going to have prices and set prices, and the initial value is going to be an empty array. Next, we want to get a function. So we can name this function whatever we want, but we're going to call it fetch prices. It is going to be an asynchronous function, and we are going to use the fetch web API and then fetch from that backend endpoint, which is /API /prices. And as you can see here, we are storing it inside of a res variable. And then what we could do here is we could just take that res variable and make sure we get the data as JSON and store it inside of a data variable. After we do that, we could console log the data to make sure we're actually getting it. And this console log is going to show up on the client side since it's a use client page. And then after, we could take the set prices function and pass in the data, and then this will become the prices variable now. And then we just have to close this function. And then the next thing we have to do is we have to actually call this function, because this function is not being initialized anywhere. So every time we land on the home page, we could run a useEffect that just initializes and calls the function fetch prices. And then the array dependency is going to be an empty array. So every time we render and load the page, we will call this function. And then in the console log, we should get an array of 4 different items showing us the prices. So let's go to our localhost 3000. We can inspect the page, and let's go to our console. And as you can see, let me refresh it. We get an array of 4 different objects with IDs and nicknames and a bunch of different properties that we can use to display on the page. Displaying the information from the GET request is very simple to do. Since we did store it inside of the prices variable, we can actually map through all of the array and display it. So we could do an unordered list, and inside of the unordered list, we could have a prices.map, and we iterate through each price, and then we have a listed item, an li, with the key, because you need a key inside of a map function, which is going to be the price.id. And if you do want to look up these certain properties that are involved with the price, you could just check the console, and then you just do price dot whatever it is inside of the console. So what we could have here is we could have a p tag, and then inside the p tag, I know there is a price dot nickname, and that is going to display the name of the actual Stripe product. And then we could have a price.unit_amount, which is also another property. And then we could close the li. Make sure you close all of the brackets, and then we need to close the unordered list as well. And now we should be mapping through all of the prices on our localhost 3000. And as you can see here, we get our home page with the price nickname and the actual price. Obviously, you have to format the price to actually look like is in the USD dollars or whatever currency you're using. But the main thing is we are using a GET request inside of a route handler, fetching that data, and now displaying it on the client side. So this is a very basic example of how to use the GET request inside of Next.js 13's routes. So now let's do a post request using the post HTTP method inside of Next.js 13. Okay, so what I did was I deleted all of the folders and files and all the code associated with the GET request, and all we have is the API folder with nothing in it. So now let's create another backend route path name called, we could call this form, because we are going to be creating a mini form. And we are going to have a file inside of the route called route.js. And one key note to take away is you cannot have a route and a page on the same layer. So I can't create a page.jsx with a route.js on the same level. This is going to throw an error, and the code is going to break. This page has to be inside of a separate folder, even though it's on the form as well for the front end. So we're going to delete that. And then at the top, we are going to import a next response from next/server. And we can start creating the function. So we're going to export an async function, and it is a post request. We are going to pass in the request. Reason why is because we need to accept the request from the front end. And then what we can do here is we can store that in a variable, which we can just call it body. You could call it whatever you want. And this is going to await the request.json. It's not request.body. So if you're using Node.js, it's request.body. If you're using Next.js, it's request.json. And then if you want to see if you're actually getting the body, you just console log the body. And obviously we're not passing anything to this API endpoint, so let's start creating our front end code to start passing stuff in. So we have to create a folder inside of the app directory, which we could call sign in. Or we could call it, let's call it sign up. And then inside of that, we want a public facing page, which is a page.jsx. So we're going to run an RFC, which is a React functional component. And then we are going to call this the sign up page. Remove the import from React at the top. And then we are going to have a form in here. So what we're going to do is we're just going to have H1, that's the sign up page. And then we'll have a form. And in the form, we're going to have two inputs. We're going to have an input for the name and then an input for the email. So first we could have a label. And then we could just put name. And then right below that, we can have an input with the type text, name equals name. And then we will have a placeholder, which equals name ... Then right below it, we'll have another label that says email. And then we'll have input type email, name, email, and then placeholder equals email. And then right here, I'm just going to add a class name because I want to style it a little bit so it looks good. So we're going to say flex. And then we'll have a flex dash column. We'll have margin left and right of auto. And then on the parent div, we could just have class name with full. And then we can say margin top of like 20. And then for the sign up H1, we will have text 6XL and then font bold. Okay. So now I'm going to mark this as a use client page because we are going to have use state, and we are also going to have a use effect. So we're going to import use state and then the use effect. And this is coming from React. And then after we're done with this, let's initialize some state real quick. So we are going to get state from two different endpoints. And what we could do here is we could have just data and set data. And this is going to equal the use state. And then we have to have an initial value, which is an object with an empty string for name and an empty string for email. And then on the form, we also want to have it on submit. And then right below the last input, let's put a button so we could actually submit the form. We're just going to say submit. And then we'll have a type that says submit for the button. After this, we need to have a function inside the onSubmit so we could actually call it when the form gets submitted. So we're going to say create user. You can name it whatever you want, but then you have to create the function here, const create user, which is an asynchronous value. We're going to prevent the default because we don't want the page reload. And then we are going to call a fetch request. So we're going to say const response equals await fetch, and it's from that backend path, which is /API /form. And then what we have to do is we have to give a few headers and the method we're using. So we're going to have an object with options, and inside we're doing the method of post. We're having the headers and we're passing it through as an application JSON. We'll close that. And then we have to stringify the data. And the reason why we're stringifying the data is because we're going to use the set data function to set the data to this data variable, which we haven't done yet, and we have to do these inside of the input. So to do that, we could give it a value, and the value is going to equal data.name. And then what we are going to do here, let's close this real quick so we don't get an error. And then we're going to have an onChange. And the onChange is an anonymous function that is going to equal the set data, and it's going to set it inside of an object, and we're going to use the spread syntax to the data, and then we are going to change the name property, and then we need to pass the event handler here, which is E, and we're going to change the name to set data. Oh no, not set data, my fault. E.target.value, and that is going to change the set data there. Now let's add the value to the second input, which is data.email. And then the onChange is going to be the same thing, except we're changing the email property inside the data object. So we're going to paste that there, change this to email, and it'll be the e.target.value. So we're taking the data, we're passing it as a stringify inside the body, and we're sending it to our backend route right here, which is a post request. And then we're console logging the body. So we should be able to get whatever we enter now on our backend. We're not finished with the code, so we will get some errors thrown at us, but we can make sure we're actually getting all of the information needed on our backend. We'll go to localhost 3000 /sign up. Now we're on the sign up page. We have a name, an email, and submit. Okay, we had no errors. So let's look at our console, and as you can see here, we are console logging the body, which is name Brett and then email brett1@gmail.com. So we are actually getting the input values inside of our backend code now. Now that we have successfully retrieved the body from the front end and we're inside of our route file, we can destructure the body even further with the actual property names, which is name and email, and this is going to equal body. So now we destructure it so we can actually just take apart each property and use it how we need to. It'll make it a lot easier for when we actually post this data on the front end client. And we can do a check here if we want, but I'm not going to. We are just going to return a next response.json, and we are just going to return the body. So we're going to push the body back to the front end. And what we do here is we usually send data back to this backend route because we want to store this user in a database. So I do have a few videos on my channel that do this, and we use MongoDB to store a user and Prisma, and we could push the information back to the front end, and then we create a user database for this user. So whenever they sign back in, they could actually log in back with their actual username and password. So after we push the body variable back to the front end, which is inside the page.jsx, we had to retrieve the body. And it's going to be from the response variable, because now we have it in the response, because that's what the variable we're fetching from. So we could call this const person, which we're storing in the person variable, is we're awaiting the response.json. And then what you can do here is you can console log the person. So let's go to our localhost 3000. We're on the sign up page. We have our React DevTools open. We could say Brett and then Brett1@gmail. We click submit and we get an object with a name and an email property that we typed in here. So now we're actually retrieving it on our client side front end, which that means we could just display it now inside of state. So what we're going to do here is right below the data state we defined, we can have another state called const, and we could say user and then set user, and we could just have the initial value as null because there's no user. And then right below the console log, we could set the user to person. So now we have a user variable that is taking in the user.name and the user.email. So right below the form, we could say if the user is true with a double ampersand sign, we can show this piece of code. So what we could do here is we could have a fragment, and inside the fragment we could say hi, and then we'll say user.name, and then we could just have a break with an exclamation mark. So if there is a user, we will show this hi and then the username, which should be Brett. So we're going to type that in and then try it again. Let's close this bracket here. Oh, user, let's close it with a parentheses and then a bracket. And we must have taken out a greater than sign. So now we're good to go. And so when we type in our information, we should get displayed down here, and we can put this in a p tag and just bring this all over inside the p tag, and now we're ready to go. So let's try it out. So we're going to have a Brett1@gmail, submit, and as you can see, it says hi Brett. So now we're able to access all the properties that we typed in inside of the inputs. We pushed it to a backend and then pushed it back to the front end. And like I said, you usually want to store a user inside of a database like MongoDB or PostgreSQL. Whatever you use, you can use inside of the route file. But those are the two examples I wanted to go over for using a route handler inside of Next.js 13. So that completes this Next.js 13 crash course. I hope you guys have learned a lot. It was definitely fun making. I have learned a lot just going through the docs, so I recommend you guys go through the docs if you have any questions. And also, if you do have any questions, you can as well leave them inside of the comments section, and I respond very quickly. So other than that, before you exit off this video, if you could hit that like button and also subscribe for more content, that would be greatly appreciated. Other than that, happy coding and have a great day.